Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Center for Humanities for our Faculty Research Colloquium. I'm Sylvester Johnson, and I'm director of the Center for Humanities. I want to thank Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum Digital Hub and is handling our technical production. Also want to thank Dominique Francesca, the business manager for the Center for Humanities, who's organizing our series of colloquium research talks. Today, we are delighted to have with us Professor Bonnie Zare. Dr. Zare is an associate professor of women's and gender studies and sociology at Virginia Tech. Her research focuses on discourses of identity, feminism, and activism in contemporary India and in South Asian women's fiction. Dr. Zare's articles have appeared in Women's Studies International Forum, the International Journal of Cultural Studies, and the Journal of Commonwealth Literature, among others. She is the founder of the Keep Girls in School project, which has been supporting low income girls in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh since 2008. In addition, her work on U.S. rural women prisoners with lead author Susan Dewey and others is Outlaw Women, Prison, Rural Violence, and Poverty on the New American Frontier, which was published in 2019. Today, she is sharing with us her research in a presentation entitled Narrative of Victim Survivors Fighting Rape Culture in India. We want to remind our viewers and listeners on the YouTube Live channel that you can enter your own comments and questions. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation, so you'll be able to have professors there to respond to any of the inquiries that you might have. So please send those comments and questions to us using the chat function in YouTube. So we're excited to have Professor Zare, and we'll have you two get started now.
Thanks so much, Sylvester, and thanks very much to the Center for Humanities for sponsoring this talk. I have a few prefatory remarks. We're meeting online by means of the resources of Virginia Tech and on land once belonging to the Monacan Nation, one of the 5 original tribes of Virginia. And while I begin by acknowledging this, I also want to say that I realize that stating that is not enough. So like many other humanities scholars, I ask that we keep in mind that our work is not just to analyze the world around us, but to help remake it. In speaking about assault today, sexual assault, you'll notice that this talk focuses on men and male-identified people committing sexual violence on women and female-identified people. But I want to, again, acknowledge that violence can occur to all genders, by all genders, and in heterosexual and queer relationships. It just so happens that this is the particular context for today. And I also want to acknowledge my positionality. I have been involved, I've been incredibly lucky to be involved in looking at issues of women and girls and their literature by and for women in India since 2002. But I also welcome people in the audience whose lived experience of India and South Asia is far greater than mine. And I acknowledge that I'm conscious of my outsider position. It's already a bit of a problematic space for a white person in the US Academy to be looking at some of these issues. And so that will come up again, but I want to just acknowledge at the outset that that there's a whole colonial weight of baggage that kind of is between me and the subject. I'm also aware that some people in the audience are new to India and might need a little bit more context. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin with that. So it's important to stop and think about the disparities of wealth that go on in the country today. Just as a couple of numbers here for you to consider. According to the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report of 2018, India has one of the lowest social mobility and economic mobility rankings in the world. 91% of the adult population owns less than $10,000. That's in 2018. 57 billionaires, though, own 70% of the country's wealth, And so you're seeing in these slides on the left the 27-floor house of one of those billionaires, Ambani, Mukesh Ambani, who made his fortune first through petrochemicals. And then on the right, you're seeing a weaver that my students and I met a few years back when we visited a place where beautiful, resplendent saris are made. And she was telling us that the thread that she makes, the beautiful golden thread that she makes, as you can see her making on this spinning wheel, is part of a sari that she can never hope to wear because she simply can't afford it. So you have these very large gaps, in the ways that people live. And then there's the urgent need for jobs is also a backdrop in this situation. So yes, of course, there's needs for healthcare, sanitation, clean water, education, but thinking about the jobs prospects can be quite grim. Between 1991 and 2013, the amount of jobs available in comparison to the amount of working age population was only about half of what was needed. Only a third of highly educated men and women, a third of highly educated men and women are unemployed, and the age group of 20 to 24-year-olds represents 60% of the urban unemployed. And this is obviously not happening in a vacuum. The refusal of Western institutions like the World Bank to offer loan forgiveness in the aftermath of colonial rule in India has contributed to this really financially insecure situation. But what it's kind of leading to is this group of people who are very resentful, right? On their TVs, on the billboards, on the stickers on the walls, they see all these luxuries that some people are getting to access, but which they don't really have a shred of belief that they'll actually access in their lifetime. As journalist Tara Koshal notes, in this growing gap between jobs and job seekers fester millions of stories of resentment, anger, stress, and unhappiness. One target for this resentment is women, many of whom are entering educational and employment spaces like never before in terms of greater numbers. India has been ranked as one of the most unsafe countries for women. It's a very conservative society, and strict gender roles and sex segregation are experienced by many people as just kind of unquestioned part of the fabric of daily life. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. So segregated educational spaces are a norm. Comprehensive sex education, we know it's got some problems in our own country, and it's certainly lacking across India. A biology lesson is often the closest stand-in in public school. And that isn't, by the way, because it's not in the textbooks. It's in the textbooks, but teachers are really afraid to talk about it. It's such a taboo topic. And so a lot of kids and teens aren't really getting what they need. Thus, then, it won't surprise you there's little to no common understanding about consent among men, among non-privileged women, maybe even sometimes among privileged women. Nowadays, there are more gender sensitization courses happening at the college level. So about 17 through 21-year-olds may be getting some, at least workshops on, say, sexism, but not necessarily that much depth about freely given mutual consent for sexual activity, one step at a time. And I'll just mention that I bring students to India yearly, and we've had the opportunity to sit in on some sex education lessons, as well as contribute to some workshops in rural areas. And so we've kind of seen this firsthand, and I'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Growing up in the very long shadow of the laws of Manu. Okay, so what does that mean? So this is a text, a sacred conduct manual, if you will, many, many verses about how to live your life. And this is coming from 500 BCE. And in the sacred code for living, which of course is seen as ancient, you still find lots of references to this. And I'll tell you, women are not characterized too well. They're characterized as fickle. They're characterized as mentally lesser than men. and as easily corrupted because of their sexual excitability. And thus, we're told, women need constant guarding, first by the father, then by the husband, and finally by her eldest son. There's a lot to unpack there, right? We see compulsory heterosexuality, we see, absolute imperative to give birth, a compulsory marriage. I mean, I could go on, right? But it's important to recognize this as a central Hindu text. And then you also have Christian inputs, you have Buddhist and Islamic and British Victorian inputs. And all of this keeps in place a fairly specific and rigid set of gender roles. Then, in addition, there are ongoing ideas about accepting your place in the caste hierarchy and the family hierarchy. So all of these add to the challenge of social movement reform. In summary, women in India cope with an ongoing sense of precarity owing to the frequency of sexual threat, street harassment, sexual violence, and this impacts their sense of themselves, as well as their freedom to travel and their sense of autonomous agency. Now, reopening this conversation was the December 2012 gang rape and fatal injury of a medical student in New Delhi. This made worldwide headlines. It was called the Nirbhaya case, Nirbhaya meaning fearless. And that was the name given to the subject who had experienced the rape because the Indian newspapers were not allowed to give her name. And that, as I said, that means fearless. But I'll just say very briefly, she and a friend, after seeing a movie, board a bus at about 8:30 at night. She's a young medical student, and the bus, it looks like a public bus, but actually it has a bus driver who's off duty, and he's driving it around on his own private tour. He has 5 friends with him. Her friend is beaten up and held back while she is raped, and then a rod is inserted inside her, and both of them are thrown out of the bus and onto the road. And after a few days, she suffers death from that injury, which because the rod punctured her intestines. So absolutely horrific case. It made people pour out onto the streets, people from different age groups, men as well as women, and it eventually led to some stronger anti-rape laws. And there are lots of actions that we can point to in the years since then. There's hashtag I Will Go Out, the nationwide gathering against harassment on January 21st, 2017 in Mumbai, things like the formation of Women in Cinema Collective to protest against harassment within the Kerala film industry. And I could list a lot of good things that had happened since that moment, but the cases pile up. Most recently, cases such as the December 2019 rape of a veterinarian in Hyderabad, the 2020 Hathras gang rape and injury of a Dalit 19-year-old in a millet field in Uttar Pradesh. All of these underline the extremely limited chances of gaining justice and needing to call attention to how the police and the government collude to protect criminals after these things happen. And in fact, just 5 days ago, the city of Lucknow in India announced a particular new program. It's installing facial recognition software to alert police in 200 hotspots where there's regular reports of sexual harassment that a woman's face has changed. And that would be like a distressed look that would call the police over to the spot. And of course, there's a lot of concern and consternation about how well this algorithm is going to work. But I mention it to show you the seriousness with which Indian cities are having to cope with and taking into account this idea that this is just an everyday form of harassment that's happening and that women are having to deal with. The cases pile up and artists respond. When they do, and do so originally, they have a different impact on us than reading a newspaper article or from a political speech or a speech given by a religious leader. In 2014, the Zuban Publishing Company, which is by and for women of Delhi, and the Goethe Institute of Germany collaborated, bringing 14 artists together in a graphic storytelling workshop. And this was a response to this attack and a desire to affirm public space for women. After an intensive week-long workshop, 14 sketches or graphic stories were chosen for drawing the line, Indian Women Fight Back. This book was published first as a combined Indian-German edition, and then later by Ad Extra Comics in Canada. And so, I mean, we're reminded, aren't we, of how a book has this global circuitry that may attach itself to it. It's compiled, in this case, envisioning a South Asian audience, an English-speaking audience in Canada, in Germany, in America, in Britain, right? And in fact, I found this book in downtown Seattle at the marvelous independent bookstore, Elliott Bay Bookstore, and that's how it first came to my attention. So like other works in this genre, it has the appeal of pop comics, right? You know, it's got columns, it's got line drawings and colored panels, balloons to show thoughts above people's head, linear stories. And even though there are different topics covered by the 14 different artists, I can say they all favor simplicity and give a feeling of immediacy. Along with the tension of moving through public space, repeated themes in the book include the narrowness of being in the role of wife and the lingering impact of frequently witnessing or experiencing violence. Although Drawing the Line was conceived of as a project in response to the group attack, and how it's symbolic of a larger problem, the book doesn't actually say the word rape itself. And there are a lot of there's an absence to, like, I guess, direct references is what I'd want to say to rape. And I was thinking more about why that was, because it definitely was different from my expectations from the cover and the title. And I think part of it is that when we know an object is going to be looked at as being emblematic of India, it is far too easy for people from overseas to read this as an example of what Spivak calls, white men needing to save brown women from brown men. You know, it really can feed a pernicious Orientalist stereotype. So I think that might have been part of why you don't see that kind of criminality so directly referenced here. Here you see women's capacity for buoyancy. You do hear fear, frustration, anger, but you also hear light and self-love and self-care and power. So these were the questions that I approached the book with. Which stories in the book illustrate responses to the ongoing threat of harassment, a form of slow violence? What is lost if we know little about the male perpetrators? And how is resistance being imagined? So returning to this idea of slow violence, most stories here provoke questions less about the impact of an attack and more about slow violence. This is a term coined by Rob Nixon in the context of environmental damage. Slow violence takes place over a long term, and it's accretive, and it occurs in diffuse ways across time and space. I've had friends say, oh wait, but aren't you just talking about microaggressions? And I guess microaggression is a bit of a synonym, but I prefer slow violence because it is more direct and reminds you of the violation itself. So it helps us remember the insidious everyday threats, this book does, and experiences of danger that are impacting women over time. The threat of rape is used to keep women afraid, and the possibility of rape is linked to denigrating language and actions used by males in public areas. Several of the book's stories stress slow violence, and the fear and anxiety that may grip a woman while moving through crowded public space. Women listening in here probably know what I'm talking about. Kaveri Gopalakrishnan's contribution, Basic Space, is of particular interest here because it explores strategies to fend off unwanted attention described to the author by 18 different women that she spoke with. So what are your strategies for walking through public space when you're feeling afraid and you're noticing men start to leer at you? what's really interesting to me is she gives equal space to a reaction and a strategy like this. Okay, well, this is how you're supposed to look. Make sure you keep your face blank and stern, put your bag across your chest, keep a straight back, stiff arms, and don't mess with me kind of stance, right? But that has equal space as someone else who answers kind of shrugging it off. This person says, of course I go out at night. Who cares? Rapes keep happening. Just carry a scarf for the taxi. Just carry a dupatta for the auto. Right. So here she is. She's kind of like enjoying her meal out and her cigarette, and she's, wearing the clothes the way she wants to. And then now that the time has changed, she's looking in the mirror and having to cover up her chest with her scarf to go into the taxi. And so it really gives us kind of this whole spectrum of responses to the same situation. Section 3 begins by intoning, in the same story, begins by intoning advice from a popular woman's website. Before going out, girls, imagine yourself covered from head to toe in a gigantic garbage bag. Okay, so what this magazine author is saying is, sort of pretend that you're nothing to look at as a safety strategy, because then maybe people will believe it, right? You see that it's in these various frames here. Imagine yourself covered, and then the girl in the middle is covered with her bag saying, ooh la la, here I am in my garbage bag. But, these illustrations show the irony, don't they? Slow violence is occurring. Girls are suddenly being told that their bodies are smelly, disposable garbage, right? What is that saying about the bodies in themselves? Here we see at a glance the demeaning state Anne Cahill speaks of as creating the conditions for rape, a degrading use of another person by making them into a disposable fragment. Now, the last section of this story returns to the earlier suggestion to adopt this, don't mess with me stance. You see it up in the top right corner here. The next panel, however, shows how being stiff and, looking kind of mad might lead to keeping all humans away, even children who are playing nearby. And then the central figure gets out an eraser and starts to partially erase the buffer zone. That was kind of an unexpected ending to me. I guess the author's telling us surely the solution cannot be utter isolation and keeping everyone at bay, right? Our need for each other has to be kept in balance with the drawing of firm boundaries. The next story is Vidyan's Sabani's Broken Lines. And this begins with, some reminders of how often this is appearing in the newspaper. Protests erupted, some aimed at amending laws on sexual assault. This is after 2012, and others just an expression of anger with no goal. Similar incidents began to be reported with greater frequency than before. And the speaker in this story is stopped by a colleague, and the colleague says, did you get the newspaper article about the rape that I sent you? And the speaker thinks, oh, is that the one with the fingers of the woman who got broken? And the colleague says, I don't know what you're talking about. And the speaker starts to realize, I tried to remember, where did I read that story? And they're all kind of getting mixed up in her mind. Similar reports were on the front page of every newspaper and magazine in sight, but the one about the broken fingers was nowhere to be found. I couldn't have imagined it, or could I? And she's brought back to sitting on the ground and listening to stories being told and read out through a painting, a form of painting that I'm about to show you. Beautiful Bengali Patachitra, right? Where you have this story unfolding on a cloth scroll in front of you. And she remembers how at the end of these stories of gods and goddesses or folk tales, there would be a warning sometimes. And she remembered that, oh, I'm remembering the warning of the girl who wasn't minding the cows properly, and then her fingers got broken as a means of punishment. As this suggests, the speaker is questioning, has anything really changed since ancient times? She thinks, I was amazed at how, despite being aware of their geographical and historical specificity, I remember these images as being part of my daily fodder of stories from the media. Have I become so used to stories of unresolved violence that I could see no difference between a mythological tale and a report of a real crime? And she ends the panels with a voyeur in troubled times and these broken merging lines. The accompanying bold strokes here emphasize the suffocating sense of sameness people receive when they track gender-directed injustice over time. And as this suggests, the story as a whole suggests, society is asked to hold two contradictory ideas simultaneously. A news item reporting on an act of violence suggests it's a random act, yet the prevalence of rape suggests this form of violence is anything but random. As Susan Bryson notes in her book Aftermath, the public is lulled into an oxymoron, seeing acts of rape as both random and yet frequent and inevitable. So this type of story helps us ask the question, why is it still so rare for sexual violence to be seen as a politically motivated phenomenon aimed at a specific group of people? And it also reminds us of the scaffolding that upholds the continuation of this crime. This pyramid shows us what upholds this crime, right? You've got sexist jokes, you've got casual attitudes, you've got strict gender roles and references to them all around you that in turn kind of fuels bystanders not really doing anything when they sense something's wrong going on at that party in the corner, which fuels also the facilitators, egging people on or applauding them after they've committed this crime. And all of this is propping up the perpetrator or offender themselves in committing this act. And this is a slide that actually we use here at Virginia Tech in our Bringing in the Bystander curriculum, headed up by the wonderful Katie May. And I just wanted to use this slide, even though totally different, obviously, geographic context, just because I think it's so helpful in showing, what all is underneath the headlines and the criminal acts that we see. This support that's illustrated by this chart provides an alibi for perpetrators and can create a norm that forced sex is, somehow a normal part of sexual acts. While drawing the line helpfully puts us inside the mind of people who have survived violation, there is little about perpetrators of these crimes, and I want to explore a little bit why that might be problematic. So I'm taking up the story by Hemavati Guha, Asha Now. Main character's name is Asha. This follows a girl who is sexually abused by her brother. As you can see, she's sharing a bed here. And one of the first things you notice, of course, is their faces are all blank and that there's this pattern of dots and dashes in every single panel that unites the family in their own interior world. They're all kind of complicit in what's going on with the sister. The uniform look of each panel and the featureless faces suggest the commonality of incest and universalizes the perpetrator and the victim survivor. As philosopher Kate Mann states, we have to avoid using words like monster to describe rapists because they're not monsters. And here you see the brother just looking like could be any brother, right? Monsters, she says, convey something unintelligible and uncanny. Instead, as she says, what is frightening about rapists is partly the lack of identifying marks and features, beyond the fact that they are by far most likely to be men and not monsters. Rapists are human, all too human, and they are very much among us. So in this story, the girl plans to tell her father directly about the abuse, but she's too afraid to do so. So at the last minute, she just decides she just can't confront her father. And the only face we ever see actual features coming to life is when she's just about to tell him, and then she decides she better silence herself. Asha finally escapes into a dorm or hostel, and then she gets married. And here's the last frame from the story. The last panel reads, has Asha got over her past? She still wakes up with a start in the night and makes sure she is always there to protect her daughter from her uncle. Yesterday's trauma lingers on today, forcing the sister to live in a state of precarity and to wonder how to protect her own child from the brother and from future violence through the generations to come. So in the story, as with all the others in the book, we don't know much about the perpetrator who's doing the harassing or the abusing, or in this case, the rape. What is leading one body in this small community to hurt another body? And I would argue it could be important to know what the brother's thinking. This could be knowledge of value. This is not to make excuses for him or to pity him, but to go beyond simply mourning, simply feeling grief. The work of philosopher Renee Haberle, who's written on the compulsions that drive perpetrators of rape, talks about how there's several possible reasons, but that one reason might predominate over others depending on the case. For instance, does the brother feel entitled to sexual pleasure and therefore use his sister as just like a spittoon? Or is he using this act as a means of escape from his own broken sense of subjectivity or set of circumstances? And if so, what are those circumstances? What's creating the resentment? Or perhaps instead he seeks to pull his victim into the same state he's in, which is utter numbness and emptiness. Again, I'm not trying to make excuses for the brother or to pity him, but to go beyond simply mourning the injustice to sister and the way society keeps silent to try to address what's actually going on, right? And try to stop the act before it gets committed. So we see a lot of questions remain unasked about the source and the causes of toxic masculine behavior. And that got me thinking about how perhaps the emphasis on women in this book and in other literature and other contexts relating to this issue, while it's valuable, of course, to focus on women, I'd be the last person to say we shouldn't, it can unintentionally showcase the ease with which we focus on a survivor's vulnerability or her symbolically damaged body, rather than asking questions about the perpetrator and his diseased pattern of thought. He's damaged too. He's damaged in the mind. And what's causing this? So much of the book is about the straitjacket of gender and prescriptions that discipline women's lives. And having heard all this up to this point, you might be asking yourself, what about resistance? Yes, these are ideas of feminine behavior that are very much agreed upon. What about resistance? Well, several stories do imagine resistance, and I'm going to talk about one of them. And this will be, I think, one of the last stories I talk about. And this is Soumya Menon's An Ideal Girl. Now, this is a story that riffs off of posters that you see hanging in elementary school classrooms and being sold in the marketplace on city streets, in which you have either history lessons or, like clothing around the world. There's these posters sort of aimed at like first, second, third graders. And this one's called An Ideal Boy. And, it shows the boy brushes his teeth and he salutes his parents and he washes his face and he prays to the gods. And so she's taking that and she uses some of those same kinds of images, but she has the text to gradually get away from those kinds of prescriptive behaviors. The story shows the girl doing what is expected of her over the years, and the obligations placed solely on her shoulders become more and more obvious as she accepts everyone's commands. Then she gets married, and then the girl does everything her new family tells her to do, just as she used to do everything her parents asked her to do. And I'll say as an aside that, male-female relations in this book are just shown as very unvarying. There's not a lot of space for a man and a woman who are married to explore anything new together. When her new family forbids her to accept paid work outside the home, considering that to be too threatening to her safety, the girl is finally done with head nodding. The next panel expands from the prior monotone squares to a liberating rectangle. They got her a bicycle so that she could get back home sooner if she was going to leave at all, but instead she cycled further and further away. She decided she'd had quite enough of being the ideal girl. So her mobility expands, and every ideal girl, it is implied, at least has the potential to break out of her picture frame. The book overall acts as a reminder of how much courage it takes to articulate taboo experiences, let alone imagine resistance. There's a story called The Photo, in which Bana says, "I'm much more than my picture," when she's sort of getting ready for the marriage market. There's a woman who flies in her imagination, becoming a bird away from predators. And in the last story of the book, Samita Gunjal's Someday, she becomes the bloodthirsty collie. So she's surrounded by these men who are leering at her, and she just explodes into this bloodthirsty, wonderfully, positively destructive goddess to chase off the men who are leering at her. And so that idea of the sort of a wistful someday, this is what's going to happen. We're going to be so strong. We're going to be, sort of superhuman, super divine, and therefore unable to be vulnerable in this way. But, these are hard things to achieve. These are not exactly concrete, things. They're flights of the imagination. And so to me, these examples underline how survivors in any kind of violent climate find it extremely difficult to assert themselves and to let their imaginations find and really put in place new worlds. So I'm going to stop my share now and return to you as a full face. And as I do, I just want to draw your attention to that subtitle here. So in summary, Drawing the Line does an excellent job of using a variety of tones and drawing styles to illuminate the challenges of negotiating public space, particularly in urban India. And it's really exciting to see something like this, because the graphic narrative, owing to its association with the comic book form, is too often dismissed anyway. And then there's very few opportunities for female artists to get published. So this is really a collection that deserves our support, and definitely questions the status quo. That being said, though, the book's tone and subtitle, Indian Women Fight Back, suggest behavioral transformation and transgression that I ultimately really didn't locate on its pages. Drawing the Line is possibly too easily consumed to create a strong demand for change. And I got to thinking that perhaps the subtitle, Indian Women Fight Back, is more of an exhortation. Indian women, fight back. One could wish the book would lead us more clearly to demand why it is still so rare for sexual violence to be seen as a politically motivated phenomenon, constituting an injustice. And I'm thinking that the organizers and editors, who are from India, Germany, and Canada, and that's Priya Kurian, Larissa Bertanasco, and Ludmilla Barch, and Nicole Marie Burton, understandably want to show the ubiquity of female harassment and the concern about women's value in a way that transcends geographic borders. But I think, unfortunately, what gets lost is the intersectionality of Indian women's feminism. There is discourse about the way different forms of marginalization can overlap and come together, making even less space and less ability to raise the voice for some women more than others. Here we have educated, middle-class, English-speaking women, and we have an urban setting. We don't have the use of translators. We don't have much about, there's really hardly anything about rural setting. And so it remains for a sequel to embody in an intersectional way forward. And I think it's important that we recognize that Dalit women are, who are outside the caste system, are disproportionately targeted for sexual abuse. And yet the artists don't engage with that specific prism of caste or socioeconomic standing. Similarly, just as we in the US have a absolutely horrible problem with casting Black men as sort of guilty before, as guilty of being sexually interested in white women and as suffering from absolutely unfounded accusations about them. Similarly, Dalit men are often accused of disrespecting or being sexually interested in or sexually harassing or assaulting dominant caste women. And we don't see any of those dynamics in the book. And I'm reminded of this as well because I was actually in India in early 2013, so about 5 weeks after this attack. And I talked with women who'd been organizing on the streets of Hyderabad. And one of the candlelight vigils was that had just been held was held in near a pretty affluent area, Banjara Hills. And I was talking with A. Sunita, who runs Anveshi, and she said, you know, it's ironic. We feminists are trying so hard, but yet we forget, right? We forget that we didn't arrange transportation for women who have no means to get out to this place, very far from their homes, to show that they're also furious because we don't think of the women who don't have the means, and we don't think of the women that are not already in, you know, in our social circle. Right? And so really drawing attention to how even in the midst of organizing, so many omissions and gaps and mistakes can be made. The book reminds us of how much courage it takes to articulate these experiences. As I said before, I think we need more attention to the flawed thinking of perpetrators, and questions need to be raised about how perpetrators continue to be protected or indirectly forgiven or shrugged off somehow. It's only through stronger coalition building that we can more effectively combat and dismantle this ongoing slow violence. The country and the world badly need to hear from more women ready to draw the line. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. That was a really fascinating discussion of this work that you are researching on the effort to fight against sexual assault in South Asia, and particularly your attention to the way this emerges in the literature that's generated. We want to invite our viewers and our listeners to send us any questions or comments you have in response to Bonnie's work, and we'll direct those to her so she can answer them. We already have some questions queued up. One is by someone who's a PhD candidate at Western University in Canada, who wanted to learn more about what you refer to as slow violence. So, could you elaborate on this concept and tell us more about it?
Sure. Yeah, so I recommend looking at Rob Nixon's book, which really does use this term in relationship to the kind of damage that we see happening in the environment. But as I mentioned, if you think about it as being a violation or creeping form of violence that is accretive, that is diffuse in space and time, but then still adds up and accumulates to create damage. And that's what that phrase is really getting at.
Yeah, great. There's another comment here who's noting that Kali is the creatrix and mother in this tradition, and is very much a double-edged concept. I don't know if you had any comments about that.
Yes, I mean, that's such an important point because I think it's difficult, in my experience, in talking to Americans about who haven't been exposed very much to Hinduism, about the concept of necessary rebirth and necessary destruction is not a concept a lot of Americans think about in relationship to the Jewish or Christian tradition. And so they have a little bit of trouble sometimes relating to this idea that it's actually a positive thing to wipe away what needs to be like the evil that needs to be taken away by Kali, and usher in a new and better world. And so that's why she's also motherly. She sees what's sort of right and wrong, and she's able to clean up if you will accept that sort of metaphor, in the sense that she's actually going around and she's drinking up all the blood of the demons so that it can disappear from the face of the earth. So yeah, excellent point about her having both sides to her.
Also, another of our viewers has said they are really appreciative of your work and the presentation. They love feminist comics, and they're wondering what motivated you to focus on this particular book. To what extent is it special or influential or representative?
Well, I want to mention two other absolutely wonderful books within this genre. This is I'm sure a fair amount of you may have heard of this. This is Bimiana. This is the story of B.R. Ambedkar's life. It told in graphic form. And he is the architect of one of the architects of India's constitution, and abolished untouchability and discriminatory practices in 1952 with that constitution. Absolutely, amazing social reformer. And so that's, I guess, another reason where this book and other books like it is what I guess started my interest in this genre. I also have A Gardener in the Wasteland to show you, which is Jyotiba Phule's Fight for Liberty is the subtitle. Again, this is a 19th century caste reformer who is out of Maharashtra. And again, a wonderful graphic presentation of this with parallels to the struggle for African Americans in the US, as well as references to other things and current day. I guess though, I'll be really honest and say it's Art Spiegelman's Mouse that brought me into thinking about the graphic storytelling tradition as a place where you could explore serious topics, right? And not just as a page turner or a time pass or a form of entertainment. And I appreciate that question. I think we could probably all agree that the length of these kinds of books is also an attraction, because they will not take that much time to read.
That's great. Another comment and question from one of our viewers, who's saying any discourse on rape in India is incomplete without taking into account state-sponsored sexual violence. And so they continue, rape is strategically used as a weapon of war in the heavily militarized northeastern states and Kashmir, where the Armed Forces Special Powers Act makes the army and the paramilitary invincible from any prosecution for rape, murder, or other human rights violations. So they're wondering if you could speak to this, and have asked whether you've addressed this in your work on rape culture in India.
Yeah. Those are really important points. And I want to be really clear about sort of, I do think that's in a really important context. It is not actually the place where I do most of my work. I do pretty much specialize in South Indian, the area of South India when I go to India. And I'm really cognizant of how difficult the whole area of Jammu and Kashmir has become, how difficult life in India has become since the Citizenship Amendment Act. Now the farmer protests. But the one thing I can say is that we can maybe gain some hope out of the idea that there are in those farmer protests not just elite farmers, but in fact people who own very small plots of land, and that movement, I think, is galvanizing people in 7 or more states to think about the plight of people who do not have, who are very much misrecognized by the state, who very much are not getting the benefits from the central government. And so we're living in a time where I hope to see change, but that's probably the extent of which you want to hear about it from me, because that isn't actually, unfortunately, something that I've specialized in up to this point.
Thanks. We have another comment, just of showing gratitude for the talk. It was a great reminder that we need to actively remember those who do not have the means to join protests or gatherings, but who are also angry and seeking change. And another question that is asking whether you might answer the question that you posed to us in your presentation, why sexual assault is not viewed as political targeting of a population.
Yeah. And I'm tempted to say, as my colleague Sharon Johnson says, it's the word sex, right? It's this idea that people hear the word sex and they go to a giggly, titillating point in their minds of when they were little kids and found out there was this thing happening between adults that they didn't really understand, that seemed to be embarrassing, and they don't take it seriously, and they don't bracket it as the crime that it is when it's forced. And I think that that is the germ of the ensuing problems with categorizing it correctly.
We have another question asking, what are some of the possible areas of research regarding the perpetrators apart from the psychology of perpetrators? And the person posing this question is interested in pursuing this area of research.
And Sylvester, could you just say that one more time?
Sure. So someone's interested in pursuing research related to this, and they're asking what are some of the possible areas of research on perpetrators other than the psychology of perpetrators. So, are there other approaches to examining the role of perpetrators of this violence that don't come from a psychological, methodological approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have to admit that I think we're a little bit inadequate in this realm because, yes, you find some of this information in, say, studies of criminology and deviance in kind of, I'm tempted to say in sort of simplistic psychological terms that I don't think are necessarily that helpful in really moving the discourse forward. But yes, I mean, criminology, psychology, some women's and gender studies, but I think a lot more needs to be done.
Another question, how do you explain to different audiences that sexual assault, you're which you're studying in a particular context, or you're looking at a particular region of the world in South Asia and particular part of the country of India, but and so some people might draw conclusions that this is something somehow particular to a certain part of the world. Of course, we just seen the hashtag Me Too emerge over the several years and have seen numerous examples. It's not that we needed more examples, but numerous examples of how deeply enmeshed and embedded and mainstreamed sexual assault is globally. But how do you engage audiences who might see this as being somehow unique or distinct to a particular part of the world?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that by saying even when I'm talking to my intro to women's and gender studies students, when we're mostly focusing on domestic US, I am really careful to draw attention to the frustration expressed by, for instance, Asian American actresses and by people who are not getting their stories told. And if I talk about India, no matter, basically when I'm in a classroom talking about India and it's anything negative, I have prefaced and really worked hard to try to talk to my students first about Orientalism and about the dangers awaiting them of falling into the trap of making, stereotypical assumptions. So I think it's not so much specific to the topic of sexual assault, it's more specific to the idea that so many people are not really paying attention to the colonialist history and to the legacy and the colonial hangover, basically, that continues to this day, economically, even psychologically. So it really does take a lot of context to do this well, and it can really be done poorly. And it has been done poorly. I'll mention the documentary India's Daughters, which I actually refuse to see because it's done by a BBC woman who, quite honestly, gets a lot of things wrong. And it's one of those very It's very simplistic. It is sort of this well-meaning feminism that goes completely, wrong in terms of critical race theory. And unfortunately, it gets circulated because it's backed by the BBC, right? So that's the kind of thing that I think we all have to be very much on our guard about, is realizing, nope, these are not uniquely bad people who are living in India doing a unique crime. This is if you portray it that way, then you are already getting the context so wrong that you're hindering efforts to make this crime lesser in every part of the world.
And another question, one of our viewers says, I believe graphic narratives have the potential to explore topics like sexual violence more than other mediums, specifically because of its form. The unspeakability of the act could be projected in many diverse ways through comics. Could you respond to this and talk about the importance of the genre of comics and how that has a particular effect within the broader context of your understanding of how the literature works on this subject?
Mm-hmm. It makes me think about Mouse once again, in that I think it's partly the ink, the dark ink, and the shadowy feeling we can get when we see these drawings. There's a stark feeling that can be communicated, and a loneliness. I think a kind of an emptiness that can be communicated. Just maybe even, I was going to say, despite the comic book context, but in fact maybe because of the comic book context. You want to think this would be a lighter read or a shorter read, or perhaps you're even thinking it won't be so very profound, and maybe that's partly how, when it is profound, it comes across to us with quite a bit of impact off the page in that way.
Well, I want to thank you again, Bonnie, for sharing the work with us. This is a very important topic that I think you have helped to further shed light on, particularly because of its visceral nature and the importance political movements that are seeking to mitigate and hopefully to end the violence that is happening through sexual assault. So thank you again for sharing your work with us. And want to thank our viewers and listeners for sending us your questions and your comments. And thanks to all of you for joining us for another session of the Faculty Research Colloquium with the Center for Humanities. So thanks very much. And please look out for our announcement of upcoming talks because we have several scheduled throughout the semester, and we hope you will join us for those.